Ah, Kavi. Okay. Chaim, I really hope this machine is better than the other machine. Right. All right.
It's working better for me.
Okay. Okay, good. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Peah, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, and perhaps we'll start today Halacha Beis. We will be learning Daf Yutes. We left off really the last line, the last few words on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. Really, we are referring back to the first halacha, to the first Mishnah of this Perek. At the end of it, after the Mishnah established the rule, the Elu Mafsikin, the Mishnah spoke about hakoitzer lashachas. That means a person planted a grain field. When grain is not fully ripe, it's called shachas. People would normally harvest shachas if they want to give it to their animals who don't need fully ripe grains. And after they harvested lashachas, if they did so in a way where they made a clear strip, fully cutting through the field of shachas harvest, leaving a large or a patch to the right, another patch to the left. Basically, it visually looks like you have two fields. Rav Meir says, indeed, that harvest lashachas is mafsik, meaning you have to leave from each field peah for its own side. And the Chachamim Oimrim that einay mafsik ela im kein chadash. They admit that if after you harvested the shachas, if you went and you plowed that strip that cuts the field in half, that separates, making each field a field for itself. But if you did not do the chadisha, just the harvest lashachas is not mafsik. And just to quickly repeat, as we left off yesterday, that behemshach to everything we learned on Daf Yud Ches, that what makes a hefsek is something that on some level is chashuv. That's the way we were approaching it. Either it's begashmi is chashuv because it's a large hefsek. Actually, sometimes it has to do with size, or it's significantly a hefsek. There is a certain chashivus that's mapsikit. The Eiluch Dover that's chashuv more than a halach. And based on that, the Gemara is beginning with the understanding that if what you did, the harvest for shachas, if it's halachically called a harvest, what will make something halachically called a harvest? The Torah says that when you harvest your fields, leave payah. If what you did triggered and therefore it demands for you to leave payah, that's something that's chash. And therefore, as we're going to now fully make that comparison, the Gemara is going to quote a Rab Ze'era that says that our Mishnah is Rav Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda that we will quote from a Masechta Menachos will they both share the same approach, that Ketzira Lashachas is considered Ketzira, which demands the person leaving Peyah, which is why Rav Meir holds that a Ketzira Lashachas is Mafsik. And that explains the Chachamim. Why do they disagree with Rav Meir? Because the Chachamim hold that if someone harvests lashachas, it's not a chashuv or a halachic ketzira, and therefore doesn't trigger the obligation for leaving payah, and you're not mechoyev to leave payah, which is why they hold that a ketzira lashachas einay mafsik. Okay, so what's the Rabbi Yehuda and Menachos? So as we will learn inside, as Chevra, hopefully we learn together. We all learned this when we were coming Ba'olam Haza, right? Before we forgot it, that not only is the mitzvah of bringing the omer matir chadash to eat, which means that the grains that were planted may not be consumed prior to the korban omer that's brought mimachras HaShabbos, which means the day after the first day of Pesach, which means on the 16th day of Nisan, but actually Mida oiraisa, we are not even allowed to harvest properly any of the grains prior to the cutting of the barley for the omer. So when you cut the barley for the omer, and by the way, the barley for the omer, that harvest is doicha Shabbos. It's done the night prior. Doicha Shabbos means that if the 16th day of Nisan is Friday night Shabbos, you would harvest the barley to be used for the omer Friday night. And prior to that harvest has to be the first, reishis ketzirchem. You're not allowed to harvest anything prior to it. Now, a couple of layers to that. We spoke about shachas. We already introduced. Shachas means underdeveloped grain. What's pshat underdeveloped grain? So we're going to make it into two phases, right? I don't know what fully ripe grain is, but a farmer knows ripe grain. Grain is not fully ripe. It's harvested for animals. If the development of the grain did not even reach a shlish, that's stam garnishment nish. That's nothing. And by the way, it could be that technically people would harvest that to give to their animals, but that's b'chlal nothing. So coming to the din of menachos, when we know that midah oiraisa, we are not allowed to harvest properly any of the grains prior to the cutting of the barley for the omer the night before it's brought. That mitzvah saseh and the negative and that prohibition does not exclude someone if they were to harvest grains that are not even a third. If the grains are a third, can't harvest it. Another nuance that we're going to learn inside. What will be that nuance? That what happens if a person begins to harvest grains in their field when they didn't even reach the third, but by the time, and that was their kavanah, they already began, at some point in the middle of their cutting, what they intend to cut, because it didn't even reach a third, some of the grains now became a shlish ready. Another nuance. Do we say, since when I began, I can finish what I began before it reached the shlish? Or do we say, as we'll see, that no. What you harvested was beheaded. But now, this that reached the third, if you know exactly how to determine that, you no longer can harvest. We're gonna learn more details inside. What we will see that there is a Rabbi Yehuda that clearly holds that once it reached the third, now let it harvest it. Now, why not? Because the Torah says reishis ketzirchem should be for the omer, and now you are harvesting something else. Now, what you are harvesting, taket reached the third, but it's not fully developed. Nevertheless, the prohibition, right, that comes from the reishis ketzirchem excludes you harvesting grain once it reached the third. Is a raya that even though it's shachas, it's not fully ripe. It's called ketzira. And you're not allowed to do it because the reishis ketzircha has to be for the omer. So that is going to be the link that Rab Ze'eda is making. And from this link, we're going to learn another link from the mitzvah of omer and the definition of ketzira to the halach of peah, as we will see. And if we'll have time, and which will be the beginning of the second Mishnah of this Perek, which will actually be, as we will see, it's going to be referring back to the first, the Elu Mafsikin Mishnah. The Mishnah mentioned Nachal and Shalulis, as we will see. Shalulis means a water canal. And basically, and even though, guys, we learned in the Gemara, I think it was yesterday, we learned in Daf Yud Ches, that even though the Mishnah says that a Shalulis, we're going to touch a water canal, is Mafsik, that's only when water is flowing through it. The Nachal, the stream, we're going to go Nachal means stream. The Gemara said, even during the time where there's no water flowing through it, we read the Bir Hagra, because the Nachal physically is wider, so then it's mafsik always. But the water canal is narrower. But if there's water going through it, it's mafsik. We're going to begin with a Rabbi Yehuda on Daf Chav, on the second Mishnah, according to the Rav Bar Tanura, that is going to be continuing to speak about the water canal, the shlulis, even though he uses another word, amas hamayim. We're going to go that it's about the shlulis, and he's going to argue with the Tanakama, and then we're going to, if we'll have time, we'll speak out. There's a machlekes in the Rishonim to understand exactly how is he arguing. But the beginning of halacha beis will be referring back to the shalulis, Rabbi Yehuda being more mekel, being more machmer, making a comment regarding the amas hamayim. So atkan the hagdama, and without any further ado, Chavretz Mamash Masul Kidvash, Daf Yutes, all the way on the top of the Amid, Rab Ze'eda, in the name of Rabbi Lazar, Zajac, that you should know that our Rabbi Meir, who says that our koitzer l'shachas mafsik, and Rabbi Yehuda in Menachos, in Bavli, it's Menachos, Daf Ayin Aleph, Shneim Amru Davar Echad. Come on, that Rav Meir Amar, just like Rav Meir says in our Mishnah, that our koitzer l'shachas is mafsik. And as we spoke out, that's because that act is halachically called a ktsira. You can argue, which is shitas chachamim. If it's not right, you're only doing it for animals. It's not termed halachically harvest, not mafsik. The man holds it is termed. where would be the expression of whether it's called harvest or not? I'll tell you where. The Torah says that leave payah. Are you mechuyev to leave payah from the shachas? That Meir holds it's considered a harvest, and therefore you have to leave payah, and therefore it's mafsik. Same. Kein Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the Rabbi Yehuda in Menachos, that Akoitzer, he would also hold based on what he says over there in Menachos, like Rav Meir over here, that Akoitzer l'shachas mafsik, and we're gonna go and read in a keep your finger in the Gemara. Let's read the Mara Fulda. He's gonna write everything that we spoke out, and the Gemara makes a point here to go both directions. Well, Rav Meir will agree to Rabbi Yehuda Menachos, and Rabbi Yehuda will agree to Rav Meir. Now let's read inside the Mara Fulda. Okay. So we have time. It's a small daf in words. Look, the top of the Maraful, that Kain Rabbi Yehuda. These words says the Maraful not Rabbi Yehuda. That's the whole chiddush of Rabbi Zeira. If Rabbi Yehuda would have said those words, we don't need Rabbi Zeira. He's not here just to remind you. Ella, like Chazin and like we see. Now the Maraful is quoting the Yerushalmi. In Yerushalmi, up until the Ois Vahada, just to know, no one quoted Daf. It was Perek Yud Mishnah Ches. I want you to know that in this sugya, in the Bavli, is Menachos Daf Ayin Aleph. That what? That what? So we already said by heart. The Torah says in Parshas Emoy, I think, that Mehachel Chermesh Bakanma, which means that from when the sickle is first put to the standing crop, bring the omer. That's the words. Mehachel means from the haskalah. From when the sickle is first put to the kama. We're speaking about the cutting of the barley for the omer, which has to be done the night before, even if it's on Shabbos. From here we learn that before you put the sickle to cut the barley for the omer, you cannot put the sickle, you cannot harvest properly. The arhetatum to harvest, but to make a proper harvest of any grain that's of good quality may not be done. Now, on that we learn that you may not harvest anything prior to the harvesting of the omer, barley for the omer. Oh, I'm sorry. Then we learn that if it's not even a shlish, if it's not even a third, gamze la shachas, but not even that, that's tam garnish with nish. Mutter. And the final thing, the Marafulda is skipping a couple of steps. So before a third, you can't. Before a third, you are. It's garnished. After a third, you're not allowed to. If you began koydem shlish, that thing will be very important for almond base. If you began before a third, then we say you can continue going, which is a big thing. So says the Mishnah that you can continue going since you began before it's a shlish. We consider that act of harvesting as a hemshech from the beginning. Then we say, even these words we find in Rabbi Yehuda in the Menachos. Now, says the Marafulda that the kiv and she is chokanim shevi shlish. Like, what's the difference of a shlish? That's the difference. See, that's what he extrapolates. Because when you began before the shlish, there was not an obligation to live payah. V'chol ksira she'eina chayv b'payah is not called ksira. And that's why if you began before a shlish, you can continue even after the shlish. Because whatever you'll be doing won't be chayiv and payah. Remember this line of the Marafulda for the end of Daf Yutes, for the grace of Daf, that we'll have in a couple of lines from you. But if you didn't begin koydem, Danny, that means you're beginning after everything is a shlish. Now, asilechi of bepayah, says Rabbi Yehuda, you're not allowed to, that from now on, which would mean, according to Rabbi Zeira, that according to the Chachamim of our Mishnah, that says that Akoitzel Shachas Einoi Mafsik, they would hold that even after the tfuah, any of them reach the shlish, you are allowed to harvest it by oimer. The Torah says that Mehachel Chermesh Bakama, meaning that once the grains are fully ready, don't even do ktsira with a keli prior to the cutting of the barley. prior to it becoming a fully common, you could do it according to the Chacham. That ain't chiyuv peya ella behevi shlish. Again, this is the shita now of Rabbi Yehuda. V'lachein asur oz lahaschel liktzar koydem la'omer, because the ksiras ha'omer tzarech liyos koydem uchalak ksiros, and this is a died isa, and this is based on a pasuk that he's quoting the bottom to Zion. That's Parshas Re'eh, my friends. That mehochel chenmesh bakama. Mehochel means from when the sickle is tchila, when it's first. In other words, the sickle first has to go to the kom. Now the kiv and the motzinu late. The loy mikra ktsira ela mashu chiyuv bepeyam. You can do it before third. Why? Because before third, it's not called ksira. After third, it's called ksira. Why? What makes you chayiv and peyam? The gam koitzel shachas viralei have like ksira im hi achshav shlish. First wide line in the Marafuld under the Gemara. V'lachin amar hashas. This meaning here, Abzeida b'shem Rabbi Lazar. The sviralei chiyuv peyas mafsik. V'chein hakoitzel shachas mafsik. The al chiyuv peyas shemafsik. Like Amanda Palig. Beautiful. The Chachamim will also agree that if what you did is chayiv in peya, that's chashav ktsira. That would render both sides now to be two different fields. No one debates that. Why did the Chachamim say in our Mishnah that akoitzel lashachas einay mafsek elam kein charash? Because the Chachamim hold that if you cut lashachas, you're not chayiv in peya, which means it's not called ktsira. That's why it's not mafsek. Ubakoitzel lashachas the ikka pluk that abanon that have meir who v'Rab Shimon the Palaga the Rabbi Yehuda. I'm sorry. The ikka pluk the Rabbanon the Rab Meir who Rab Shimon the Palaga the Rabbi Yehuda. Over there, Menachos, the one who argues with Rabbi Yehuda is Rab Shimon. So the Rab Meir and the Chacham, the Rab Meir Chachamim here is the Rab Shimon Rabbi Yehuda. The Sfira Lei the Shachas av Ktsirihi. Rabbi Yehuda kerav Meir diktsirehi. Beautiful. Okay, we'll stop over here. Now I'll go back in the Gemara. Says further, Rab Ze'eram, that Kamod, that Rabbi Yehuda Amar, Chiyuv Bapeya Mafsik, Kain Rab Meir Omer, Chiyuv Bapeya Mafsik. Mamash Gavaldik. I want to also read, Chabra, the Gemara speaks on both ways. That Rab Meir holds like Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rab Meir. Look inside the Rashi really on the left column, 3-4 lines from the top. Rab Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rab Meir, the Hakoitzel Hashachas, which is here, Peya, as we're going to refer to it, Peidik Beis, Mishnah Aleph. And Rabbi Yehuda, the Peidik Rabbi Shmuel, and here he's not like the Maraful that quoted the Menachos here in Yerushalmi. He's quoting the Bavli. The Rashi really is quoting the Bavli. Rabbi Shmuel the Menachos. O Maisel Alakama. The Amen Lakoitzel Shachas. The Chiye Hevi Shlish also Lakoitzel Lefnei Omer. Now it's interesting that the Marafulda quoted. What's the source? A mitzvah say Mahachel Chermesh Bakama, which is a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. The Bavli quotes a pasuk from Vayikra Chav Gimel is Parshas Emor, and there it says, we quoted that in the intro. It says Reishis Ketzircham. Clear. Reishis Ketzirchem is for the Omer, which means prior to you doing the Ktsira of barley, for the Omer, don't cut anything else. Don't cut any other grain. The Hevi Shlish cut Ktsir, or Batzim Shlish Lemikra Ktsir. Why? Because its Bechlal cannot be eaten. Okay, back inside the Gemara. Now, Vaham Ashkachinan. The Rav Meir is the one that says Chiyuv bepeya mafsik. How do I know that? We're going to further prove, because Rav Meir never said that Shachas is mechuyev in peya. But the Gemara is going to prove that Rav Meir holds that it's the Chiyuv of peya of the Ktsira that is the reason why Shachas is mafsik. Where do we see that? Because it says in a Braisa, what happens if you have a field, you did not harvest any of it? Punk in the middle, there's a whole strip that became empty naturally. What would that be? Either achola goivai, that locusts, grasshoppers, they ate it, they consumed it, or kirsimu and the malam ants severed it. Stam lohoyer, that when it comes to the goivai, we say the word achila. What about what ants don't eat? What did we say? So he writes over here that Ashirili is not a good word. That achola is milmaila litzad hashibalim. It's when the locusts they land, they go from up down. When the namalim eat, the word kir simua means they sever. Sever means because they begin milmata lomaila. So it's a different logic. Bottom line was you had a field. You were planning to harvest everything for you for achil asadam, but in the middle there's a break. What happened? The goyvay ate it, the namalim severed it, or shivaratu haruach, the wind blew it out. Punkt in the middle, a tornado, or behema, punkt an animal. He went to beside it and he ate that. In the middle, he made a whole hole. No, it was not harvested. Now, many people don't even have the words petura. But if we're going to keep the word petura would mean that since this is not considered the hefsek, even according to Rav Meir, so if I took payah from one side for all, it's effective. One side patters the other. If we'll have the word, or we don't even have that gear. So, hakoil moedim. Now, who's hakoil? The Braisa doesn't say who hakoil is. Hakoil implies that in another case there's a machlokes. Here, everyone is moedim. It must be referring to our case. No, we have in our Mishnah Rav Meir holds if you were koitzel shachas mafsik. Says even Rav Meir would be moedim that only im charash mafsik. If the balabas of gezen, anyways, guys, the middle of the field is eaten. Let me plow through it. That, like the Chachamim say in our Mishnah, Elam Kein Charash. But Imla, Imle Charash, Eino Mafsik. This is referring to Rav Meir. Now, what would the logic be? It says the Gemara Daf Yutes on the base. Who's the Hakoil? Mani Hakoil Moedim. It cannot be referring to anything other to our Rav Meir. Lav Rav Meir. Now, by the way, why would that not be a hefsek? Why would that not be a hefsek? The answer is because that strip doesn't have to have payah left from it. Because the Torah says, you understand? And that's not called a bekutzrechem. That la Rav Meir, that what? That Amar mepnei pater payah. Because in that case, you are taki exempt from payah. You're mafsik. Now, before we go on, I want to point out the following. And here is the question. If this Braisa, the Braisa is saying that if you did not do Ketzira, if the Goivai, if locust ate it, then the Malim, they severed it, then from that area, you don't have to go and leave anything because you didn't harvest anything. We learned in the beginning of Perek Aleph, we had a Chazal. Now I know the Chazal learned it from extra words in the pasuk, but we learned that Ketzira is not the only thing that's machayiv to leave payah. We had plucking, and then we had oiked, uprooting, which is not a bekutzrechem. And there was no argument. The Braisa said that you have to leave payah. So the Merash Shirilio, now you could say, yeah, because that was included in that pasuk. The Rash Shirilio has a gavaldik word. The Rash Shirilio, I'm going back to Daf Yutes Amud Aleph. He writes in the 8-9 lines from the bottom. Kirsimua numalim milumata. The Tanan lekamon b'chalani de ptura mechiyuv pei. Why? Because the ketzircha amarachmana. We're medayik ketzircha. So if it comes from the word ketzircha, says that Ashiril yava'af lagab dilael. Pedek aleph halacha dalet. Ravinan, we included that afilu oiker, which is uprooting. Toilish is plucking. Now, why is that? Why don't we learn just like that? The ktsircha is mimayet. If it happened naturally, well, when you uproot it, that's not an act of ktsira. When you pluck it, it's not an act of ktsira. Says that Ashadilio Hanim Mishum the Iboya Katzala. You did it, and when you did it, you could have done it ba'ifin with a knife. And we have a rule: the dami leroya lebila the ain bila makevs. So we have a din that in the Beis Hamikdash, by a karban mincha, the largest keli that held flour that they made was that which can hold 60 isoroins of flour. Why? Because for every karban mincha, you have to bring one loig of oil. And the loig of oil has to potentially be able to be mixed in with the flour. And we have a tradition that if you have more than 60 isoroins of flour, that amount of oil won't be enough to be fully mixed in all the flour. We also learned in Menachos that when they had the flour and the oil, even though the oil was poured in that keli, You don't actually have to do the mixing. Bila means mixing. So if you don't have to do the mixing anyways, so the Gemara asks, so why don't we say that if a person pledged a 61 isodins, let him still bring it, make a bigger keli, and put everything together? So the answer, no. It has to be ra'ui lebila. Kol hara'ui lebila. Bila means mixing, even though you didn't mix it because it was ra'ui lebila. We have it in a mikvah, for example. When a person has to go to a mikvah properly, men don't go this way nowadays. When a woman goes for hilchas nida, right? So she doesn't have to open up her mouth. The water doesn't have to go into her mouth. Nevertheless, if she has stitches in her mouth, you got a problem. If there's a chatzitza, if there's something stuck in between her teeth, that's a bona fide chatzitza. Even though it's miut, if she's makbid, it's a chatzitza midrabana. You got a problem. Water doesn't even have to go into her mouth. Many times we say, it has to be roi that if she would have opened her mouth, the water would have gone into all the parts of the mouth that are closer to the front. So this is a rule that we have throughout. It's interesting how the Rashirilio is bridging it over here. In other words, not just the limud that we have for the plucking and for the uprooting, but since you did it, it was royal tzira. Just like you chose to pluck it, you could have taken a sickle. Masha Enkin, if the ants ate it up, you were not doing any of it. It's not shaykh to say ro'oi because it was not a maisi yedayot. Okay. Now, just like we clarified that I've made it here, we'll hold the Rabbi Yehuda. Now let's go the other direction. That Kai, the Sanin and Taman, as we learned, and again in the Babli, it's Menachas Daf Ayin Aleph. In the Yerushalmi, we are referring to Perikut Mishnah Ches. Amar Rabbi Yudan Emosai. When are you allowed to harvest any of the grains prior to the ketzira of the barley, which must be done the night of the 16th of Nisan? When are you allowed to do it? Again, why would you not be allowed to do it? So we have either the Reishis Ketzirchem, or we have from Re'ei Mahachel Chemresh Bakama, if it didn't even reach a third, because Lekula Alma, any grain that didn't even reach a third, it's not called grain, and when you harvest it, you're not harvesting grain. And again, this other detail. If you began before it reached the third, you can continue. What does that imply? And now you wake up and you say, I want to do it l'shachas. People don't eat it if it's a shlish. People only give it to animals. You're not allowed to do it. Then also liktza. Why? Because the Torah says reishis ketzirchem. So if the word ketzirchem disallows you from harvesting from when it hit a shlish, why? Because that's called ketzira, goes together. The Torah says ubekutzrechem leave peya, and therefore yiktzad, if you did it either be'isur dir or any time beheted, then chai bepeya. The davar shu chai bepeya is going to be mafsik. Okay, so that's good. Now that we make this comparison, the Gemara is going to make a big statement. When we're speaking about the Omer, when does the mitzvahs asay, lav from the asay, kick in? You cannot harvest anything before you harvest the barley for the Omer. What does that disallow you? It disallows you to begin to harvest anything else. In other words, the isur of not harvesting goes into effect from the beginning. If you ask a person, when does the chiyah of peya go into effect? I'm talking about practically. When do you leave peya? At the end. At the end. Not at the beginning. This thing, we already explained what we explained. But this other layer of achel hevi shlish, not called ktsira. And the Mishnah writes beferish with Rabbi Yehuda that if you began before a shlish, when it comes to the question, are you allowed or not allowed? You didn't even do it's Yud Dalid, it's Yud Gimel Nisan. And on my field, Yud Gimel Nisan in the morning, none of it is a shlish. I can begin to harvest for whatever reason. You're ruining it. I'm doing it for animals. I can do it. In middle of the day, it hit a shlish. So we're saying Rabbi Yehuda holds, you can continue. Let me ask you a question concerning peya. Would we say the same thing regarding peya? Would we say that we also established that if what I did is not called Katsira, I'm not chayiv to leave Peah. If what I'm doing is called Katsira, I'm chayiv to leave Peah. What happens if I began to harvest before a shlish? And I went 100 feet. But then the second 100 feet was when it already is a shlish. Do I have to leave a Peah from that second 100 feet?
And is there a minimum also?
I don't know the numbers of minimum. Let's go with my example. In other words, here the question will be in this detail, that now that we established that when it comes to the issur of harvesting anything before you harvest barley, you know what, just participate. If you began koydem shehevi shlish, you can continue even la'achar shehevi shlish.
Without leaving.
Well, there we're not talking about that. We're talking about you're not doing the violation of your trader says don't harvest anything before you harvest to the omer. No, you began before the shlish. In other words, we're saying that the whole act goes la'achar, the beginning. I would argue, you know why it goes after the beginning? Because when did the issur of not doing anything before, when was that issur on you? At the beginning. So since I began beheaded, I can go the whole way. When do you leave Peah? In actuality, when do you leave Peah? At the end. Even though we take a learn that they if you left it in the beginning, if you left it in the middle, but normally Peah is left at the end. I might think that when a geya Peah, we would not say that if I began before a shlish, and then I'm doing 1 day work, and then at some point noon it hit a shlish. I would think maybe from whatever hit the shlish until the end, maybe I should have to leave Peah. Why? Because Peah is left at the end. Maybe you should look at the end. At the end, it was already heavy shlish. You might think so. Says the Gemara, Rab Zera Boye. Now I know that some of the Noise Kalim say, not only here that Boye in the Babli always means a question. Here it's a statement. Actually, the Rashirilio Befedish it clearly says, Umi Boye Rab Zera. Not a statement, not the way the art school interpreted. He is wondering, he has a question, whether this detail is the same or not. Now, why would it? It should not be the same. I'm just saying, why shouldn't, again, you understand what I'm saying? It should not be the same because since the actual fulfillment of Peah is at the end, so we should look at the end, not at the beginning. Come on. So he wants to say that we don't say that, even though I explained why you should have said it. We don't say that. That come on, the Rabbi Yehuda Amar, that if his chalacheloi hevi shlish, afilo hevi shlish, listen, Rabbi Yehuda holds must be that way. Must be that way. Why must it be that way? Because of everything we said until now. Because now that we said that Rabbi Yehuda follows Rav Meir, if Rabbi Yehuda would have held that from the moment it hit the shlish, from that you have to leave Peah. By the way, Leked and Shikha, because the trader puts them together, we compare them all together. Well, if Rabbi Yehuda would have held that on that which hit a shlish, you would be chayiv to leave. If you would be chayiv to leave, then you would not allow to continue. Now that we're putting them together, so Rabbi Muzman Zagin, that Rabbi Yehuda holds that they mamish travel on the same track. So even though in middle it hit the shlish, you don't leave Peah, because if you would have to leave Peah from that which left the shlish, you would not allow to continue. Kain Meir, we're putting it together. Kain Meir, that Omar, that he's not that he actually said it. He's suggesting that he would also say that his chalachalevi shlish, afilavei shlish, will still be pater melekam shikana peya. Let's read the side that Asherilio that I just quoted. It's in the left column, a little bit towards the second half, a little bit further the second half. The mi name Bahai Svaranami. That Rab Meir of Rabbi Yehuda ki adodininu as Rab Ze'eda made them. We're not debating Rab Ze'eda's statement. Kenal Farashu Yezu. Oh, let me know. So we need a tama. So I'm going up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the top of the left column by the Nekuda. The need of the tama the Rab Yehuda Hainu. Why taka? You see, you need a proof. Like I'm explaining good. Why do you need a proof? I would think that Peah doesn't go like Omer. This detail. And again, why not? Because the issue of cutting before the Omer is in the beginning. You can't begin cutting. When do you leave? Not when it's triggered. When do you leave Peah? At the end. Basar Soif. I would think that you go by the end. And why Taka doesn't Rabbi Yehuda say it that way? Because since the Torah, after in Parshas Emor, and that's why the Rashi Lilyon quoted the Babli source for this prohibition from the Reishis Ketzircha, from Parshas Emor, where it says the Parshas Emor Ksiva Mitzvahs Peah, after Omer it says Peah. No, it says Reishis Ketzirchem, and then it says that now by I just know Vayikra Chav Gimel is Emor. Here we have Pasuk Yud. It's not mamish a smichos one after the other, and here we have the mitzvah stays and pasuk chav beis. Doesn't matter. It's in the same pedic in the Torah. We have both of these dinim. That's why lemidrash. And I'll tell you why we do compare them to the other. What will be the logic? I'll tell you the logic. Because what we are saying is that when the concept, the obligation of leaving payah, don't look at when you leave it. You have to look at from what are you leaving it. You know what you have to leave payah from? From an act of ketzira. That's the nukud of today. When does the act of ketzira be defined as an act of ketzira? From when you start. That was the whole chiddush of Rab Ze'ed. And therefore, it's not just the smichos is megala that. The smichos that Rashi earlier brings. The Torah's juxtaposition. It's not about when you leave pay. From what do you leave pay? Once we establish by Omer that if you began prior to a shlish, then you began doing something that's not called ksida. And then everything you do later, even though the physical mitzias changed, now the tfuah is already heavy shlish. I'm in middle, mitten of something that's not called ketzira. And since it's not called ketzira, you don't have to leave payah from a non-ketzira act. So don't look at the leaving of the payah. You have to look at from what you're leaving payah. And that's why, boy, whether it's a question or the other one say, Hitaka says it, that like Rabbi Yehuda, so Rav Meir, even though in the middle, forget about the Yud Gimel Nisan. Today, in whatever middle of the year, when you are harvesting grain, if you began prior to a shlish, everything you do is a hemshech of the beginning. None of that is called a ktsira, even though I left a substantial amount from which normally you would have to leave payah. And Rav Meir holds that once you are koitzer l'shachas, you have to leave payah, not leaving payah, because you didn't do an act of ktsira, you were not koitzer. Why not? Because you began. Here you see the power of everything goes after the beginning. You know, Yid begins the day. That's why it's the bikurim. You begin a day by davening and learning, or learning and davening and learning, or davening, or theoretically davening. However, you begin a day in a certain way where God is important, David is important, and hopefully more meliktin than something else. It mamash, it goes on the whole day. It goes on the whole day. The whole day is a whole different thing. And for people like us to make the extra effort, taka to do nothing else. To not, if it's shaykh, not to look at your emails and not to gurnish in the morning, because it goes by the beginning. How powerful is that? Okay, I thought we'll go to the Mishnah. We'll stop over here, and God willing, halacha beis in next year. It's very good, guys. A good Shabbos. See, this in the Bible would have been just written out in 1,000 more words. I'm telling you, there's a lot over here.